All right, today we're going to explain the virtual network service endpoint. So let's imagine have one of scenario. You have on-premise and you have Azure and this on-premise. And there, of course, connectivity. So imagine now you need or customer. Or maybe your manager asks you to migrate your app and database for your ERP system. So we need to migrate your app service, your app on-premise and database or ERP to Azure. On VM. And your customer or maybe your manager asks you to reduce your cost and administrative requirements. So you're considering using some Azure platform as a service, PaaS services as a service. So you have a storage account here and or maybe can storage or maybe more storage. Not one. Okay, sorry. And this storage account, the customers hold a service, or we can see a large files asset such as engineering diagram. Okay, and this engineering diagram have proprietary information, and you must remain secure for unauthorized access. So these files must only be accessible from specific system. This requirement from your customer or managers. So here you have a virtual network. And there, also regarding to Azure environment, you have service endpoint. Let's take another color. So use virtual network service endpoint to extend the private address space. Right. So what we're going to do here, we need to use a virtual network. Virtual network service to extend your private address space in Azure by providing a direct connections to your Azure service. So a service endpoint, the service endpoint will help you or help us here in our situations. You secure the Azure's resource like storage to only your virtual network to be accessed by virtual network. So the service traffic will remain on Azure's backbone and doesn't go to the internet. So if it's not clear to you, let me just try to more explain here. By default, if you remember by default, when we build, let's take this is your on-premise. And this is Azure's, let's take another color. By default, the Azure service, if you have SQL or storage account. So by default, the Azure services are all designed for direct internet access. So all Azure service, whether it's a SQL database, RPS system, wherever, all Azure services have a public IP address, public IP address, included platform as a service. Here, I'm not mean one service for platform service. Maybe a platform service like a SQL database or a storage account or whatever you have in your environment. So because this service are exposed to the internet, anyone can potentially access your Azure service. So there's a main default behavior for users. So that's why we have a service endpoint, Microsoft invented service. Endpoint. Can connect it to a certain platform as a service directly to your Azure private address space in your Azure. So they will act like you are in the same virtual network. So in this time, if you use a virtual address, a virtual private, address space to access platform as a service, directly adding service endpoint. So this adding service endpoints doesn't remove the public IP address, but simplified or simply provide redirect of your traffic. So in this time, you're going to use Azure, your Azure resource, whether the SQL or storage account or in any platform as a service, we're using privately using a service endpoint. But does not mean, again, adding service endpoints doesn't remove the public endpoint. It simply provides a redirection of traffic.